recent polls also suggest that Americans' greatest fears are not nuclear war, are not nuclear annihilation, are not Chinese spy balloons, not toxic water, but other Americans, that we are fearful and distrustful of each other. That's by design. That didn't happen because we're innately suspicious of each other. We've been pushed further and further in this way because of the way our media silos go, the way our politics goes.
How you doing, online world? I'm Amber Yang for Peers and wanttoknow.info. We're part of a growing movement of alternative thinkers seeking to awaken collective change by educating the public on deeper forces that are driving the conflicts, wars, injustice, and corruption we see in our world. And we're here to bring nuance, balance, and the best of all minds, hearts, and bodies as we uphold a vision for a society built by human goodness and possibility. So thanks for joining us here today. Today, as part of our media series, we explore the rising complexity and corruption within our media systems, which is leading to an unprecedented public crisis in trust when it comes to our media providing responsible, diverse information, independent of special interests working to shape public opinion and censor alternative voices. Becoming increasingly conscious about the media we consume is a core practice for societal change that anyone can practice wherever they stand on the political spectrum. Bias is everywhere, and there's no one place to find exclusive truth. So how do we build the right skills and context to navigate this information landscape effectively? Today, we talk with Mickey Huff, co-founder of the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation, and professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College in California, where he co-chairs the History and Journalism Department. He's also the director of Project Censored, a media watchdog group with a tradition over the last 50 years to explore propaganda and censorship in our news systems and to advocate for the importance of independent voices within these systems. And before we jump in, let's just take a moment to pause, take a breath, and get present. These topics can be quite challenging and complex, and research shows that even just taking a minute to slow things down, like our heart rate, can make a significant difference in how we think and relate to each other, especially in the face of the culture wars that are leading us to be more polarized and divided than ever. So let's stay open-minded with each other as we explore these topics. All right, let's jump in.
So you're the third director in a noteworthy movement of media activism under the banner of Project Censored, helping multiple university campuses across the country integrate student and faculty voices into, an annual expression of top independent news stories of the year that have been either covered up, censored, or only partially covered. So we're not really getting that full story. And as someone who's contributed to Project Censored as a student and faculty evaluator, what a great tradition to be a part of, Mickey. And, what a pleasure to have you with me for Peers and Want to Know.
Well, it's an honor to be here, Amber. And, I'm here as the result of the great work of Carl Jensen, the founder of Project Censored back to 1976. For 20 years, Carl really brought that question to the college classroom, that what is news and whom do we trust? And, as someone that was a rather news savvy person, he himself realized his own shortcomings and his own inability to decode propaganda or to broaden his own media habits. And he was awakened by Watergate in terms of the way media function in a lot of ways, because they didn't, it took a minute for Watergate to break into the press, and alternative independent outlets were actually doing more work on that and looking to hold Nixon accountable for many different kinds of crimes, not just what happened with Watergate. In fact, in many cases, there's weird parallels between what's happening with Trump's indictment of Stormy Daniels and the threatened impeachment of Nixon. I mean, I'm not saying that either one of those things are acceptable. I'm just saying that those are not the greater crimes that these people were involved in, that these are people that really just were a threat to the power elites themselves, as well as the general public. But that's what drew the ire of the establishment toward them, is that they stopped playing by all the rules and they started trying to serve their own interests more than the ruling class.
Right.
And Jensen kind of asked that question and saying, like, well, I thought the Fourth Estate was supposed to hold these groups accountable and not be part of that ruling class narrative. And the Washington Post broke that story, and everyone knows it's like, oh, the system works, and the press held them accountable, and not really. But the immediate result was that the Democrats wanted him out of there, and then that got the rest of the malaise of the 70s. But Jensen said, if I could come up with a class where students routinely ask questions about what the establishment media are not covering, I wonder what kind of a list of stories we'll get. And that was the genesis of the top 25 stories. And the phrase critical media literacy wasn't even a thing in the 70s, but Jensen was doing news literacy, and he really laid the foundation for it. And then when newspaper people and editors got mad at him, they got up there like, hey, you're attacking us. Jensen said, well, actually, I'm not. I'm trying to offer a constructive critique about how we can improve the system and improve journalism in the public interest. And they said, well, this is news judgment. We can't cover everything all the time. This is the column inches, the network TV. There's no cable or internet yet, right? And so Jensen said, okay, that's fair. So he started paying attention not just to what they weren't covering, but what they did cover. And that's when he coined the term junk food news. He was like, they cover so much titillating, sensationalist garbage that they're making bad news judgments because they're not covering important stories. And then, of course, that continued until Peter Phillips took over in the late 90s and coined the term news abuse to talk about how the news media will distort important topics like propaganda to spin or frame. And then I got working with Peter in the 2000s after 9/11 and worked with him and Andy Lee Roth, who's still our associate director. I became director in 2010. And, I've been fortunate to work with so many amazing students and faculty, yourself included. We all share one thing. We all want to know. We all have a curiosity. We all want to understand what's happening around us, and we have a respect for news and information and journalism. What we see around us increasingly is what passes for news and journalism is neither. It's propaganda, it's framing, it's messaging, it's attacking, it's divisive, it's spectacle, it's distraction. It's a lot of things, and it's misinformative or disinformative, or now the new term malinformative. What we try to do with our site and our books, our radio show, our films at projectcensored.org is give people tools to navigate that landscape without beating anybody with a truth stick. This is it. This is what's going on, and everything else is wrong. You're not allowed to ask questions about this issue. We don't want to encourage that kind of authoritarian behavior. We want to encourage people to be curious and creative and bring their voice to the table of what they're seeing going on around them and reporting about what's happening in their communities. Mis and disinformation is a real problem, which was a Trojan horse, right? The moral panic around fake news was an establishment Trojan horse to say, well, we'll control it, NewsGuard, Snopes, PolitiFact, we'll tell you what the news is. Yeah, I mean, that's not far from what Fox said 20 some years ago when they bought stations in Tampa, Florida, and they fired 2 reporters for exposing Monsanto products and the Posilac issue with the dairy supply. And they were saying, well, it's unnecessary and it's not good for human health. And because Monsanto had a member of the board at Fox News on both, they killed the story and fired the reporters. And the guy that ran the news station said, we paid $3 billion for these news stations. We'll tell you what the news is. Well, I tell that story because it's historically profound about who owns it. Right. And A.J. Liebling in the 60s in the New Yorker wrote, the freedom of the press belongs only to those who own one. And we now live in a billionaire press, right? With the social media and the big tech, 6 companies controlling 90% of media. We've got an incredibly small group of oligarchs and billionaires and billionaire interests that control the media ecosystem in a lot of ways. And that problem is still with us. It may not look as crass and brazen as that information that came out in a lawsuit over Fox and Monsanto in the late 90s, but it's the same ethos. That we will tell you what the information is. And then anybody who asks questions can just be lumped all together. Like you can be a seasoned award-winning journalist like Chris Hedges or Matt Taibbi and somehow get lumped in with people who are just so far out the spectrum that they don't even know what facts are.
Right, like Seymour Hersh.
Well, there you go. And we just did a piece on that, and I was on Ralph Nader's show with Hersh about the Nord Stream pipeline. I don't know if Hersh's reporting is in fact true because of his undisclosed source. However, he was ignored by the establishment press. They wanted to ignore his reporting, despite his much vaunted history going back to My Lai and other Syria, bin Laden. I mean, the guy's got credibility, oozes credibility. That doesn't mean he's right about everything. And that doesn't mean we can suspend judgment about his unnamed source. But we'd be doing a real disservice to ourselves and the free press if we pretended he wasn't a significant figure, making a very plausible argument.
Killing the messenger, discrediting the message.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an age-old tactic and
propaganda technique.
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, in the days of the 60s, there was a wave of political assassinations. One of the things that I think that the CIA and FBI through COINTELPRO and so on, I think one of the lessons they learned through the Church Committee when they got outed a little bit was that they didn't necessarily need to do that. All you need to do is destroy somebody's character and credibility, and they're like in a living hell of a prison for the rest of their lives because it follows them around like tin cans on their tailcoats through the pages of history. I mean, we've seen this happen in the recent past with Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald. And again, I'm not saying everything they report is true or accurate, but what I'm saying is that they actually haven't changed their desire to unearth, uncover, and report about things the public needs to know, regardless how popular they are. And what's mostly shifted is the baseline, right? 15 years ago, Taibbi was a liberal hero. Now the IRS is knocking on his door about identity fraud as he testifies to Congress about government interference in social media. Coincidence? Probably not.
Right.
But the damage done by that's a fear tactic. It's intimidation. It's, we don't like what you're saying. Then they lump him in with Musk. He's a Russian. He's a right winger. He's a Trumper. I mean, I know Matt a little bit. He wrote an introduction to our book a few years ago, and he's none of those things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean I'm endorsing everything he does either, but it should be glaringly obvious that when the establishment circles wagons around those people and really starts trying to get you to not pay attention to them, you should really start asking why.
It reminds me of Tulsi Gabbard when she announced that she's leaving the Democratic Party because she saw just the vast corruption within the Democratic Party and the ways in which the Democratic Party is actually pushing us more towards war and even nuclear war. And she testified at a public hearing on the federal weaponization or the weaponization of the federal government and said, you know, in my decision to leave the Democratic Party and my speaking up about various issues, including COVID, you know, now they're saying that I'm secretly working for Putin.
There's no nuance. There's no gray zone. There's no learning, right? And the other thing too that's connected to that is that when we do make mistakes as human beings, because we will and we do and we have to have some kind of an infrastructure to allow ourselves to change. How do I mean, that's one thing that works to build credibility with people, is that you say, you know what, I was wrong about that, or I didn't know that. And now that I know that, I'm going to really think about it. Maybe I won't totally change my mind about it yet, but I'm on the road to re-examining what I thought I knew. Yeah. And that's, to me, what wanting to know something is about, is it's following the depth of it to where evidence takes us, not just where my confirmation bias kicks off for a beer at 5 o'clock and says like, yep, we're all good. We know what's going on today. The Let's Agree to Disagree book on conflict management, communication, critical media literacy, the textbook we wrote for Rutledge, we encourage people to be skeptical of sources and to not get personally engaged in attacking with people. But we also encourage people not to get cynical just because we lose trust in institutions. I mean, we're living in an era of mass distrust. We're cratering in terms of trust in things like media this past year, that a majority of Americans don't trust the media. They don't trust the CDC. They don't trust the government. This is an epistemic crisis. And the weaponization of information and the politicization of just what it means to be civically engaged and how is very destructive. Yeah, we should be arguing about the material, the evidence, the motives. We shouldn't be personalizing it into sports teams, like my team truth and your team lies. That is not the way that we move forward together as a society, and it's no way to build communities. And so media can be used to build these kinds of communities, which we highlight in our Media Democracy in Action chapters every year. And free speech and free expression isn't just about talking. It's about listening. It's about processing. Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 isn't just about the right to get your message out there. It's also about your right to be heard.
A lot of my own personal experience of being able to talk to people across differences, and I've been in many diverse spaces where that was like the norm, like I feel like half of it at least was just slowing things down and being able to say, let's each have a moment to be heard for our perspectives. And that alone was a big game changer.
If it's just everybody talking all at once, it's a cacophonious mess. And in many cases, that's what our political landscape sounds like to many Americans. And that's why they get more cynical. And being cynical is it's part of civic decay, and it's a disease. It's a civic illness. How can we make media more accountable? Well, it's not to just trash them and say the New York Times is a propaganda rag. Okay, it kind of is. But it's also an institution that's been around for a long time, that's done a lot of great reporting, that's produced a lot of great journalism, that's corrected some of its mistakes.
When we think about like CNN and Fox, Washington Post, New York Times, BBC, MSNBC, the majority of the public leans on these corporate platforms to inform them of societal issues. And because it's mainstream, that must mean they're trustworthy and have the facts. I've gotten into arguments with family about the vaccine, and they're like, well, what are you listening to? Because we listen to New York Times and they have the truth. So I think like the hurdle with media awareness is just developing the awareness of the special corporate interests that drive what we specifically see, hear, or read on these platforms. Like you said, the money, the political values, the ownership.
Conflicts of interest.
Right. So can you say more about, how can we get the public, the general public, to become more aware about corporate media and just the power dynamics within those systems?
Understanding how the propaganda model works that Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky put forward in 1988 about ownership, advertising, reliance on elitist sources, what's newsworthy, or who are newsmakers and shapers, and thus by default, who isn't. How does the public play a role in flack or boycotting certain sources to influence public opinion and the press? And then, of course, the last filter in the propaganda model is about ideology. And once upon a time, it was anti-communism. After 9/11, it was anti-terrorism. In the last several years, it's been more back to an anti-Russia, anti-China. But there's also a pro-ideological perspective. And this actually came out in the New York Times, too, a number of years ago, when one of the editors there said that he didn't believe that the New York Times was a biased source and that it was an objective source. But then he turned around and said, we proudly support capitalism and neoliberal economics. And it's like, well, I don't care if you do or not, but that's a bias. For you to not recognize that as a bias is part of the problem. And many of the readers of the New York Times share those biases, so they don't see them either. It's the fish in the water. It's the air they breathe. You mentioned vaccines as just one controversial topic. You can fill in the blank with many other topics. Syria, regime change, what's happening in Iraq still, the Nord Stream pipeline, Ukraine, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of this stuff, when you start to really look into it, you experience cognitive dissonance because you start hearing things from different angles and different perspectives that don't all seem to line up. And you use a word that's very common. You use the word mainstream, and that's been a great marketing coup for the corporate media, because they've gotten the public to accept that because they're the biggest game in town, or the longest game in town, that they're somehow the only game in town. And that's why Jensen started looking at alternative and independent media, is because that's just not true. And in fact, what we found out over 7 years of Project Censored is that it is the alternative and the independent press that tend to be as accurate or more so on matters that matter most to the public than the establishment or legacy media. Notice I don't call them mainstream. There's a reason for it, because a dozen companies that control big tech and the corporate media don't speak for Main Street. They don't necessarily represent the views of working people. They don't necessarily represent the views of marginalized people. We have multiple public vulnerabilities, from a collapsing public education system, a increasingly corporate, co-opted, and controlled media ecosystem, coupled with economic decline, lack of opportunities, and an increased focus on sensationalism and division. Recent polls also suggest that Americans' greatest fears are not nuclear war, are not nuclear annihilation, are not Chinese spy balloons, not toxic water, but other Americans. That we are fearful and distrustful of each other. That's by design. That didn't happen because we're innately suspicious of each other. We've been pushed further and further in this way because of the way our media silos go, the way our politics goes, and the way our language helps reflect that in myopic ways. Blue, red.
Yeah.
It's lonely to be an independent critical thinker, which is why, the late great anarchist feminist Emma Goldman said the most unpardonable sin in society is independence of thought.
Independent media tends to listen to the voices of people that aren't just part of any sort of government establishment, part of or has some sort of political status. Like, we actually go on the grassroots level. We talk to people from all different levels of society. It's more often in independent media that you actually get some real understanding of why China and Russia is being painted as the enemy right now. And we start looking deeper at the special interests involved in maintaining U.S. hegemony in the global economy that we live in. And so you start getting these perspectives, or like the highly acclaimed, highly credited doctors and scientists that just got demolished in light of them just speaking up about concerns around vaccine injuries, concerns around the lockdown and the impacts on society. And so, as you said, it's not really about the fact that they have the truth, but the fact that, part of what it means to be in a democracy is the open flow of information where we can suss out these different perspectives.
The very act of the free press, the right to question, the right to pursue information and hear different views without ostracism, without punishment, without a strain of authoritarianism that says, I am science. Any disagreement with me is a refutation of science, which is the most unscientific rubbish one could utter. It's propaganda. And even though the moral panic may justify that propaganda in the moment, it has lasting damage. And the lasting damage of it is a real decay in public trust in our institutions to perform science. And in the case of the COVID narrative, here we are 3 years on. It went from, it definitely was zoological, to anybody who thought it was a lab leak was a Trumper, to a year later, well, maybe we don't know and we should revisit that. And we didn't ask the questions that we should have been asking. Right. Which is not an endorsement of an alternative idea. It's simply the notion that they weren't asking. Right? They were not functioning as a fourth estate that is an independent free press protected by the Constitution to prevent government interference. They were promoting their own narratives. And that's where we run into the problems. How many times the media establishment press got things wrong? How many times they were so sure of something that anybody that said anything else was a conspiracy theorist, only to come around a year later and say, oh, did we say that?
Right. Just like natural immunity, right? In the beginning.
Well, that's another one right there. And now, in fact,
there's
two studies, one from the Lancet and another just came out saying that people with natural immunity from COVID might likely have better, longer lasting immunity than the mRNA shots. And the other was, now they're also saying that it's bad. It's not the greatest idea that kids are inoculated, which, by the way, was circulating, 2 years ago at the time. But anybody that said that was an anti-vaxxer and anti-science. And I'm not suggesting that the CDC and Fauci and others, are just, rank, vile, evil people, which is what, one of the sides of the argument will say. I'm just saying that they're part of a mass establishment apparatus that is huge and sprawling, and like us as humans, is constantly grasping for some kind of sense, right? Constantly trying to fashion their narrative around what makes sense to them and their interested parties.
I had a friend I was talking to about, wouldn't it really add to the public health message to talk about the role of vitamin D, to talk about the role of immune-enhancing supports? She was saying, well, if Fauci came out and said, oh yeah, there's also all these exercise, managing our stress, the role of vitamins and healthy foods to boost our immunity, she's like, it would confuse the public health message. Whereas if you focus on vaccines, washing hands, it's simple and it's easy for the public to get.
This is why big pharma is problematic. And it's ironic that in many cases that the very people that are suspect of big pharma because of Purdue and opioids and how many people have been harmed from big pharma over the years, that somehow on this, they're all right. They're all angels. They're all knights in shining armor coming to rescue everybody. And we're on Team Pfizer. This is something that happened around 9/11 that was similar. Many people that were liberal or on the left end of the spectrum, they kind of lost it and said, well, no, our government may do X, Y, and Z any other time, but not on this day.
Right.
We may have a long history of corruption and duplicity and COINTELPRO and false flags and everything else that's been documented and ignored for decades, but not on this day. Right. And that's a psychological reaction that's connected to trauma, that's connected to moral panics. We really should be relying on a free, independent press to help us ask important questions, to help make sure information is vetted and not outsourced to some third interested party to say what's true or false. I mean, many of those institutions end up spinning things because they want to maintain the efficacy of an establishment-controlled narrative. And that's problematic, particularly if one believes that they live in any kind of a free society. And when we talk about independent media, it's not that it's objective. It's just that we tend to know what its biases are when we go to The Nation or when we go, to Amy Goodman's Democracy Now, or when we go to Yes Magazine, or when we go to the National Review. Much like you were suggesting that the public health message also be equally broadened rather than focused in a way that ignores things that might help people. As if it's, again, a competition, one or the other. It says, well, part of the regime of trying to take care of yourself may include these 6 different things. And with COVID, we know that there were a lot of comorbidities, and people that have other health risks tended to have harsher experiences with those infections. And of course, we know people that were, had the shots and so forth, got sick the same that other people did. And that doesn't mean that people that didn't get it are anti-vaxxers or whatever. And it doesn't mean people that did were totally duped. We've got to get out of the polarization and the vilification of the other in order to be able to ask the kinds of questions that are more to the core of who we are as human beings.
It reminds me of the psychophysics law called the Weber-Fechner law that basically says that the more background noise you hear, the less signal you can detect. And when I think about all the societal noise, which is what you're referring to, just the polarization, the blaming, dehumanizing, the divisive-based, attention-grabbing ways that our media is right now, we're not getting the real signal out of anything. And so all that noise is distracting us. And so when I think about navigating our media consciously, I think of where is the signal in anything we read? And we have to reduce the noise. We have to reduce all the ways in which we're being told to be divided or get mad at this or get mad at that or feel this or feel that, to really look at it objectively, and it's so interesting. We're talking about just, what truth means. I mean, just last year, the Department of Homeland Security created that disinformation governance board that got quickly shut down. But it was basically this, they were laying out these plans to police false or misleading narratives online and they had this summary of terrorism threat to the U.S. homeland, which looks at anyone challenging the official narrative of the proxy wars like Russia and Ukraine or COVID or Syria. And what's interesting is that at the bottom of the page, they encourage people to maintain media literacy to recognize and build resilience to false or misleading narratives. And then I opened up that page and I looked at their infographics, including their one on navigating COVID disinformation. And the quote was, rely on state and local health official websites, as well as the CDC and FEMA's rumor control webpage. And I thought,
which are regulatory captured agencies with people that have conflicts of interest.
Right. And then, so, to me, it's like, okay, well, what I see as critical media literacy is to expand out of any narrative that deems itself as official or primary.
While there's real concerns and real things to worry about, those that are providing the official solutions are unfortunately deeply flawed and have conflicts of interest, the degree to which it's going to further truth decay, as the Rand Corporation itself even called it. But then that spawned media literacy initiatives that are now being run by NATO. NATO has now partnered with media literacy organizations in the United States to teach media literacy around the Ukraine in a way that's completely biased. So it's like how the Atlantic Council, which is a PR part of NATO, is a fact checker for Facebook. I mean, again, it's kind of back to the idea when you're talking about who's the newsmaker, who's the news shaper, who do we go to, then who do we not hear from? Who checks the checkers? Who is going to be the arbiter that says, well, look at these people over here that check these facts. Look at the narrative that they're spinning around it and look what they didn't ask, right? That's what doing your own research means. It means asking questions when they need to be asked, which institutionally, we rely on the fourth estate, right? They're the ones that are supposed to be asking these questions to hold people in power accountable so that they can be honest with us and we can be meaningfully civically engaged and we can mitigate our disagreements and build on our commonalities. But that's been completely exploited by the ruling class to maintain their hegemonic economic and military domination of the planet. Peter Phillips wrote about it in Giants on the Power Elites. I mean, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's real. There is a billionaire class. There are hedge funds and major banks that have deep-seated interests that really do impact what governments are even able to do in their own countries. We don't need to focus on lizard people and green men and UFOs. We need to focus on, well, what are these actual people and institutions doing and what are their net effects on our ability to be self-governing and our ability to be self-aware? You mentioned the signal, losing sight of the signal. Well, the whole United States of Distraction book is about losing the signal. It gets lost in the din. And then we become part of the noise when we get on the social media bandwagon and we start factoring in and filtering it in and out and fighting here and doing this. We then become part of the noise. Any source of information is likely to be biased, is likely to come with conflicts, is likely to be as right or wrong on any given day, depending. And we build those relationships with those kinds of sources. And that's why media literacy, being critical about the media that we have, and by sharing independent or different sources with people, I know that this is not like some elixir. This is not some like easy, perfect solution, but it's something that takes time to build. And it's something that I think is, you're giving people things they can utilize and build and continue to use throughout their lifetimes. That isn't the one-stop shop or the click the button or the what have you. And it's not click, like, share. It's a process. And it's less sexy, right? It doesn't always sound interesting. And because, moral panic crowd will say, well, this is a problem now. We need to solve the problem now. We'll sort this out later. Well, when does later ever come? We're still fighting 9/11 wars. We're still dealing with people locked up at Guantanamo. We're still dealing with the Patriot Act. You mentioned the Disinformation Governance Board. Turns out they were doing that anyway, behind the scenes with Twitter and Facebook. They were doing it anyway. They just weren't telling you about it.
Frances Moore Lappé, she's an incredible thinker and
Yes.
activist on many different fronts. And she poses this really simple question. She says, what qualities bring out the best in humans and what qualities bring out the worst? And one of the qualities that bring out the worst in humans is scapegoating, right? And that's what we see on all levels, on the public level, on social media with cancel culture and the culture wars we see, but we also see it in our very own government agencies disseminating what is truth and who should be trusted. And so we have that, but what brings out the best in humans is the ability of ours to collaborate and cooperate with each other, right? And that's where the building relationships and building community through having that open dialogue, right? Building those communication skills. Like I love that you and Nolan wrote that book on Let's Agree to Disagree. How do we actually work through conflict when we have different views about really controversial, complex societal issues, right? That have multiple faces.
Well, Julian Assange is one of the ultimate scapegoats of the last decade. Someone that is being imprisoned and being accused, trying to extradite him from England to be charged under the Espionage Act. He's an Australian citizen. He's not even an American citizen.
Right.
That's the ultimate punishment for him, simply punishing what our own government knew about its own actions and was actively suppressing and lying about. And when you look, you could, all the other noise around Assange aside, and we just published a great book by Kevin Gostola at the Censored Press called Guilty of Journalism about the Assange case, one of the best books on the Assange case and what it portends for the future of journalism, I have to say. And I hope people read it and think about it. But what's happened to him, it has been allowed to happen. And it's the allowing of it to happen that's as troublesome as what's literally happening to him and his family individually, because of the lasting damage it has to anybody who wants to tell the truth and speaks the truth as power, not speaking truth to power, but simply making available information it speaks for itself. The information clearly shows that Chelsea Manning released documents that showed that U.S. soldiers were knowingly killing civilians and reporters and laughing about it. Those are war crimes. That's the ultimate scapegoating of whistleblowers. That's damaging to journalism, damaging to the free press, and then thus ultimately damaging for any efforts of having democratic self-governance or living in a free society. Those that are shouting about slogans of freedom the loudest are often the purveyors or the suppliers of the chains of oppression. In fact, Eddie Bernays, nearly 100 years ago, when he wrote the book Propaganda, said that it's the control of people in free societies that is the most important mechanism for democratic culture, because you can create the illusion of freedom and participation by reducing choices to what elites want you to consider, and by definition, what they do not want you to consider. And it acts as an ultimate arbiter of legitimacy or illegitimacy.
What do you envision to be a structure in place for media platforms to model that open, healthy dialogue that we need to make sense of our times?
Let people speak, let people be heard, let people be questioned. You can substitute people with institutions or representatives. Try to be transparent about your motives as to why you want someone to get something the way you see it, and don't force it on them. Be open to being questioned, even though you may be asked questions you've been asked a million times and you already have the answer formulated. Let it happen. When you interrupt and interject and shut down because we're all impatient, we're impatient people. All of us can be, especially when we're frustrated or annoyed or what else, because we're also emotional creatures. That's the kind of stuff that it does require practice. I didn't just pick up a guitar one day and be able to play, Yngwie Malmsteen or Paganini riffs. So I don't just open my mouth one day and all of a sudden I have some eloquent argument for some detailed, historical, complicated subject, and so it's important that we recognize that and recognize that other people are at different stages of knowledge,
Right.
And if we're going to learn, I'm going to learn if I want to teach somebody something, I have to learn what they don't know as much as what they do know, so as I can approach it in a way that's as didactically effective to them, that is also, interestingly enough, going to come back and help me improve my own pedagogy or how I've communicated it to them, so that when I encounter another student, I'm learning from them too. You know, teachers are not just, quote, experts. They're people that are always learning.
Yeah.
Because there's something else to know, and there's a way that we might do things differently. And
Right.
and I think modeling that kind of humility doesn't mean surrendering expertise or knowledge. And too often, I think admitting we're wrong or admitting we don't know something, or I think it's perceived as a weakness, and our culture does that to us, right? There are other cultures in the world that don't perceive that as weakness. They look at that as a strong character suit of someone that's saying, "Oh, you want to know that, you want to listen to me, you're learning something from me." Wanting to know means being patient. You said slowing down. It means diversifying news sources. It means active critical listening. It means understanding cognitive biases. It means understanding that history and context matter. And that means you got to get back on that feedback loop that I talked about in the course that I teach. Today's fake news can be tomorrow's fake history. I think that we learn best from when we're constantly surveying for new ideas, new perspectives, and we're curious about what we have to learn next.
Yes.
And I think media is a vehicle to help us maybe learn what's next, but we need to learn how the media use us in order to understand how we can better use it and become it in a way that is more aligned with those principles overall.
As we close this interview, I've got a question for you. What is something that is giving you purpose or meaning or hope in these uncertain times? Like what's keeping you grounded as this busy activist that's doing multiple things and making a huge difference in people's lives?
You know, everything I do is interconnected, whether it's, through playing music, art, having a family, teaching, learning, writing books, doing radio shows, movies. I've been fortunate enough to have people be very patient with me and accept me for who I am, wherever that was in my life. When I was first hanging around with Peter Phillips in the 2000s, I was probably like Spike the dog, in the Tom and Jerry cartoon. Hey, what are we going to do next? What are you going to do next? You should do this. You should do that. What am I going to do? And somebody there had patience enough to say, hey, you look like you really want to do something, so let's figure it out. We're all teachers, we're all students. And I think we don't want to lose sight of that. And I think, again, I'm very fortunate for the things that I get to do. The people that I've met and the people that have enriched my life tend to feed me in a way that it allows me to continue to go out and hope to be able to do that for other people.
That's beautiful. Let's keep holding on to that dream, shall we?
Thanks so much, Amber. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Mickey, for meeting.